I think it's a very important topic and a very important time in the relationship of the dynamics around the peninsula. So I'm going to be talking about the U.S.-North Korea relationship, and I think most people who've heard me speak before understand that I have kind of a dim view of this, the potential for this relationship to move forward in the near future. And part of that is because the U.S. is, at least over the last 10 years, if not longer, has been trying to do two main things. They've been trying to pivot toward Asia. They keep getting pulled back into other parts of the world, but they're trying to do that. And they view great power competition as the challenge of the 21st century. And this makes sense. It falls neatly within the U.S. security thinking since the end of the Cold War. And this competition helps justify our, defense programs and our defense spending. But what it does not do, I would argue, is help the U.S. focus on important and much more likely threats that come from non-peer adversaries. Adversaries who because of their asymmetrically weaker military and economic status vis-a-vis the United States, fall into a category of challenges to be managed, not necessarily solved. They do not set the pace for U.S. national security policy unless they act up, like conducting provocations and things like that. They are placed on the back burner and ignored in the interest of the status quo. Nowhere is it more clear than on the Korean Peninsula. Asymmetry in relations between the United States and the less powerful adversaries, North Korea being one of those, creates challenges not easily addressed by traditional foreign and security policy initiatives. The relative imbalance in relationships between the United States and weaker powers carries unique dynamics which over time can change the international landscape more so than what is occurring in the great power competition, I would argue. Pressure campaigns from the last few U.S. administrations have found mixed success with asymmetrically weaker powers. Under President Obama, pressure helped pave the way for a deal to slow and cap Iran's burgeoning nuclear program, which of course President Trump played a role in undoing. North Korea, on the other hand, has remained a relatively immune to U.S. pressure diplomacy aimed at curtailing its nuclear program, taking only limited and reversible steps toward denuclearization. The United States' asymmetric challenge with North Korea stems from four primary causes. One, a conflict of interest between the weaker power, North Korea, and the stronger power, the United States. Two, a divergence between the two powers on relative value of North Korea's nuclear program, in which North Korea probably sees the nuclear program in more existential and more profound terms than the United States does. Contentment, number three, contentment versus dissatisfaction with the status quo. North Korea being dissatisfied with the status quo, the United States being, for the most part, satisfied with the status quo. And for North Korea's fear of becoming even weaker if the status quo continues. These dynamics of asymmetry have largely governed the U.S.-North Korean relationship for the last 40 years. The Biden administration had moved away from the high-stakes transactional diplomacy of the Trump administration to pursue a strategy of coercion or strategic patience, similar to the Obama administration's foreign policy toward asymmetrically weaker adversaries who defy key U.S. security objectives. I would argue that a return to traditional pressure strategies, or basically strategic patience, will likely lead to continued stalemate, or worse, a growth of an adversarial threat held unaccountable. And as long as he thinks that he can keep North Korea in a box, in a status quo situation, he's going to sit there and continue with strategic patience. So I don't really see that there's much that he is going to be able to do unless North Korea has a breakout phase in its nuclear program. Right now, even though they have the Hwasong-15 that And so the United States at least believes it still has some time, although I would say that that time could evaporate very quickly if North Korea starts to test in a very rapid case along the lines of what they did in 2017. An empirical analysis of interactions between North Korea and the United States on the issue of North Korea's program shows that traditional foreign policy tools like coercive diplomacy and sanctions and things like that have limited impact. With North Korea, engagement cannot be conducted as a black and white zero-sum game. It must be re-examined and incorporated in a larger, in part of a larger regional strategy, I think, for the U.S. to make it work. Unfortunately, the U.S. has tended to see North Korea as a zero-sum game on the Korean Peninsula, that we win, you lose, you win, we lose. And it needs to be seen in the broader context, I think, of U.S. policy in Asia. So what can be done? Now that North Korea has assumed a more intransigent profile, which it really has since the failure of diplomacy at Hanoi, which may continue to, and it may continue to escalate as long as the status quo exists, the United States needs to figure out a way forward. There are a number of things that the Biden administration could do if it wants to actively pursue its goals regarding North Korea, rather than to default to another period of strategic or unstrategic patience. First, it should undertake a serious assessment of the Trump era's top-down approach and see whether there are aspects of this thinking that could be used to reinvigorate diplomacy. I would argue that President Trump had a basic framework worked out for North Korea. I think the top-down strategy was probably the way to go with North Korea. Unfortunately, there was no follow-up strategy after that, and it was strategic patience by another name. Second, while it might not be politically feasible for conventional presidents such as Biden to meet with Kim himself, he should consider appointing a special representative and give him significant authority to act on his behalf. In addition, the president should also consider publicly endorsing President Yoon's offer of an inter-Korean dialogue or engagement. And this needs to be made very clear to the North Koreans. It can't just be said that we're supporting South Korea. It needs to be much more profound than that. These steps would put a framework in place for exploratory negotiations designed to determine the art of the possible, and in particular, what concessions each side is willing to make. Right now, we are not at a point where we're willing to see what each side is willing to put on the table. Third, the Biden administration should consider refraining from demonizing North Korea, which will only cause Pyongyang to lash out further and eschew diplomatic outreach. And fourth, the administration should consider revisiting basic principles of U.S. North Korea policy. Instead of adhering to a black and white policy which lacks flexibility in pursuit of an absolute goal at step one, the administration should look at ways to introduce pragmatism into a reality-based approach. Geography and 70 years of history have created a situation where the United States cannot dictate its will that North Korea denuclearize. We just can't do it. We don't have enough leverage. We do not possess the leverage, and our past actions towards regimes such as Iraq and Libya have made the situation even more difficult by crystallizing in the minds of North Korean leaders that only a nuclear deterrent will forestall eventual regime change. This has created the intractable position both countries find themselves in today, a zero-sum game where there must be an absolute winner and an absolute loser. Because this relationship is an asymmetric one, North Korea, as the weaker power, is not willing to make the first move. It will not make the first concessions. And that is something that the United States has a real problem, because when we talk about dealing with North Korea, it usually follows that North Korea has made some sort of substantive move toward denuclearization. I don't think North Korea is willing to make that first move. Maybe it will be behind the scenes and working out some sort of tit for tat, but it is not going to do that publicly. And for its part, the United States feels that it has right on its side, justice on its side, in pursuing pursuing nuclear nonproliferation and is unwilling to reward bad behavior by giving in on the first on economic and security guarantees that Pyongyang covets. Since the Singapore summit, U.S.-China relations have turned sour, and Beijing's support for sanctions and the U.S. maximum pressure strategy have begun to wane as well, I would argue. And I would argue that without China, they're in lockstep with the United States. And I understand the reasons why China may have done that. But in the absence of that, the U.S. policy in believing that maximum pressure will win the day and cause North Korea to denuclearize, I think, is just naive. In order to address this challenge, U.S. policymakers need to make two major shifts in their strategy. First, drop denuclearization as the single solitary objective of U.S. strategy toward North Korea. As currently constituted, denuclearization is a condition precedent for negotiations instead of serving as the ultimate goal at the end of the process. We need to put denuclearization toward the end of the process, not the beginning of the process. You can have good faith efforts toward denuclearization in the beginning, but to expect that there will be full denuclearization, if that is even possible, is definitely not going to come in the early part of the negotiation stage. It's probably going to take concessions on the part of the United States or maybe South Korea to get the ball rolling. Second is the initial phase should seek to freeze the North Korean nuclear program in return for limited sanctions relief tied to a snapback provisions if North Korea violates three demands. One, no provocations. Two, no testing. Three, no proliferation. And these measures are in place for once these measures are in place for a reasonable time, the two sides could then pursue a reciprocal process in which additional steps toward denuclearization can be coupled with a strategy of corresponding reciprocal concessions and confidence-building measures. And second thing that we need to do with our strategy is integrate the denuclearization into a larger U.S. strategy in Asia focused on managing the relationship with China. And the reason that I say this is that getting inside the body politic of the United States to actually think about adding pragmatism to its North Korea policy, it has got to be some way tied to our overall relationship with China, which really for the most part governs U.S. policy in Asia. And by keeping denuclearization of North Korea as an independent goal unto itself, the United States has undermined its ability to manage relations with its regional allies while giving adversaries additional ways to counter U.S. Influence in the region. So in my opinion, as we go forward over the next few months and years, especially under the Biden administration, which is a very conventional administration, I would argue that I would be very surprised to see the United States really kind of change its North Korea policy that has really been in place for all intents and purposes since the Bush administration, and definitely was followed through under the the Obama administration. It's only if North Korea begins to act up and really begins to another major round of testing and gets closer to developing a fully viable nuclear program, will the U.S. be forced to actually move away from this desire to really kind of hold on to the status quo. Thank you.